What would you wish for if a billionaire offered you anything in the world? A house? A car? Money? A 7-year-old girl got 3 wishes, and what she asked for left a grown man on his knees, weeping like a child. Her wishes cost nothing, yet they were worth everything. Let me tell you why. Welcome to the story room. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Sometimes the biggest houses hold the smallest hearts. Let me tell you about a story that changed everything I thought I knew about wealth and kindness. In the heart of Chicago, there stood a mansion so grand it made people stop and stare. It belonged to Richard Warren, a real estate mogul whose name appeared on buildings across 3 continents. They said he could buy entire city blocks with a single phone call. But here's the thing about Richard. He had everything money could buy, yet he lived like a man who had lost everything that mattered. The mansion was beautiful, don't get me wrong. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they seemed to touch the clouds. Marble staircases spiraled upward like something from a fairy tale. But it was cold. Not just in temperature, but in feeling. It was a house, not a home. And Richard liked it that way. Or, at least, he told himself he did. For 8 long years, a woman named Grace had cleaned those empty halls. She polished the floors until they gleamed, dusted the paintings worth more than most people's houses, and did it all without complaint. Grace was a single mother, raising her daughter on wages that barely covered rent in their tiny apartment across town. But she never asked for more. She just worked quietly and faithfully because she had someone to live for. Her daughter's name was Sophie. 7 years old with curious brown eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room. Most days, Sophie stayed with a neighbor after school. But that particular Tuesday morning in October, everything changed. Grace's neighbor had fallen ill. There was no one to watch Sophie. So Grace did something she'd never done before. She brought her daughter to work, promising her to sit quietly in the kitchen, to not touch anything, to be invisible. Sophie tried. She really did. She sat at the small kitchen table, coloring in a worn notebook while her mother worked upstairs. But children are curious creatures, and Sophie was no different. She noticed her mother's coffee cup, still half full and cold from the morning rush. Her mom always drank it bitter because they couldn't afford sugar at home. The sugar jar sat on a high shelf. Sophie pulled over a wooden stool, climbed up carefully, and reached with her small fingers. She just wanted to make her mother's day a little sweeter. Just one small act of love. That's when Richard walked in. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, stunned. In 8 years, no one had dared enter this space except the staff. And here was this child, balanced on a stool, reaching for his sugar with determination written across her face. Their eyes met. Sophie froze, terrified. And in that moment, something neither of them expected began to unfold. Sophie's hands trembled as she clutched the sugar jar. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted to make my mom's coffee better. She works so hard, and she never has anything sweet." Richard stood there, briefcase in hand, prepared to deliver the kind of cold reprimand he was famous for. He'd fired people for less. His staff knew the rules: stay invisible, stay silent, stay out of his way. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the honesty in her voice. Maybe it was the way she didn't make excuses or try to shift blame. She just told the truth, simple and pure. When was the last time anyone had spoken to him like that? Without fear, without wanting something, without pretense? He set down his briefcase and left the kitchen without a word. Sophie carefully climbed down from the stool, her heart pounding, certain her mother would lose her job because of her mistake. But hours passed, and nothing happened. Richard went to his study as usual. Grace continued working, unaware of what had transpired. And Sophie sat quietly, wondering why the stern man with the sad eyes hadn't been angry. That afternoon, as Grace scrubbed the floors of the West Wing hallway, her vision began to blur. The room spun. She tried to steady herself against the wall, but her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the marble floor she'd just cleaned. Richard was passing through to his next meeting when he heard the sound. He found Grace lying motionless, her cleaning supplies scattered around her. For a split second, he thought about calling someone else to handle it. That's what the old Richard would have done. But instead, he ran to her side. Grace? Grace, can you hear me? His voice carried an urgency he didn't recognize in himself. Sophie came running from the kitchen, her face pale with terror. Mama, Mama, please wake up. Richard pulled out his phone, canceling his meeting with investors from Dubai. He called his personal physician, demanding he come immediately. He carefully lifted Grace onto a sofa in the drawing room, something that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The billionaire who never touched anyone, who kept the world at arm's length, was now cradling his housekeeper's head, telling her she'd be okay. When the doctor arrived, he diagnosed exhaustion, malnutrition, and dangerously high blood pressure. This woman has been running on empty for too long, the doctor said quietly, glancing at Richard with something like accusation in his eyes. Sophie sat on the floor beside her mother, holding her hand, whispering promises that everything would be all right. She didn't cry. She was too scared to cry, too busy being strong for someone who had always been strong for her. And Richard watched this little girl, barely 7 years old, display more courage than he'd shown in decades. Something inside his chest, something he thought had died years ago, began to ache. Grace recovered slowly in one of the mansion's guest rooms. Richard insisted she stay there until she was completely well, and for the first time in 8 years, Grace slept on sheets that cost more than her monthly salary. Sophie stayed too. And that's when everything truly began to change. The mansion had never known the sound of a child's laughter. It had never seen crayon drawings taped to refrigerator doors or heard bedtime stories read aloud. But now it did. Sophie brought life into those empty halls, and somehow, without even trying, she brought Richard back to life too. She'd leave little notes on his desk. Don't forget to smile today, or you're doing great. She'd ask him questions nobody else dared to ask. Why do you look so sad? Or don't you have any friends? One evening, as autumn leaves swirled outside the tall windows, Richard found Sophie in the library, looking at his family photos. There was one of him, much younger, smiling with his arms around his ex-wife and young son. That was before the divorce, before his son chose to live thousands of miles away, before Richard decided that success was all that mattered. You look happy here, Sophie said softly. What happened? Richard sat down beside her, and for the first time in years, he told the truth. I forgot what was important. I chose work over people. And by the time I realized my mistake, everyone I loved was gone. Sophie thought about this, her small face serious. Then she said something that would change everything. Maybe you need some wishes. Richard smiled sadly. Wishes don't come true, Sophie. Not for people like me. Everyone deserves wishes, she said with such certainty that Richard almost believed her. All right, he said, playing along. If I could grant you 3 wishes, what would they be? He expected her to ask for toys, or perhaps a bigger house for her mother. That's what any child would want, right? But Sophie's first wish stopped him cold. I wish my mama could stop worrying all the time. She thinks I don't hear her crying at night, but I do. She cries because there's not enough money for rent, or food, or the medicine she needs. I wish she could just be happy and not scared. Richard felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. In his world of billion-dollar deals and corporate takeovers, people wished for promotions, for stock options, for corner offices. But this child, who had every reason to wish for herself, wished only for her mother's peace. That's your first wish? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, Sophie nodded. That's my first wish. Richard Warren, the man who believed emotions were weakness, felt tears burning behind his eyes. Then consider it granted. Before the story continues, subscribe. These stories are written to change lives. The next morning, Richard made calls. Not to investors or business partners, but to people who could help. He paid off every debt Grace had accumulated, medical bills from years past, credit cards maxed out buying Sophie school supplies, rent she'd been behind on. He arranged for her to see specialists about her health issues, doctors she could never have afforded. But more than that, he changed her position. Grace was no longer just a housekeeper. She became the estate manager, with a salary that made her gasp, healthcare that covered everything, and hours that actually let her live like a human being instead of a machine. When Richard told her, Grace wept. Not quiet tears, but deep, shaking sobs of relief, of gratitude, of disbelief that life could change so suddenly. Sophie hugged her mother tight and whispered, "See, Mama? I told you wishes come true." Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. The mansion transformed. Grace cooked meals in the giant kitchen, filling the house with aromas of homemade bread and soup. Sophie did her homework at the dining table that had sat empty for years. And Richard, for the first time since his divorce, came home looking forward to what waited for him. One Sunday afternoon, as they walked through the garden together, Sophie turned to Richard with that serious expression she got when something important was on her mind. "I'm ready for my second wish," she announced. Richard smiled, expecting perhaps a request for a pet, or art supplies, or dance lessons. "What is it?" "I wish you'd remember how to be happy again." The words hung in the air between them. Richard stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "You have everything," Sophie said, gesturing at the mansion, the grounds, the world he'd built. "But you're still sad. I see it in your eyes. You laugh sometimes now, but it's like you've forgotten how to really smile. So that's my second wish. I want you to remember that being happy is okay. That it's not weak to care about people. That you deserve good things too." No one had ever seen Richard Warren cry. Not his ex-wife during their worst fights, not his business rivals when they tried to destroy him, not even his son when he said goodbye. But standing in that garden, looking down at this 7-year-old girl who barely knew him, Richard felt tears streaming down his face. "How did you get so wise?" he whispered. "My mama taught me," Sophie said simply. "She says being kind costs nothing, but it's worth everything." And so Richard's second transformation began. Sophie taught him to notice sunsets again, to laugh at silly jokes, to play card games and lose on purpose just to see her victory dance. She reminded him that life wasn't just about building empires, it was about building moments worth remembering. Winter came to Chicago, painting the mansion's windows with frost. Inside, a fire crackled in the fireplace where Richard, Grace, and Sophie sat together, looking like the family none of them had planned to become. It had been 3 months since that October morning when everything changed. 3 months of laughter, of shared meals, of learning what home actually meant. Richard had started calling his son in California, awkward conversations at first, but growing warmer each time. He'd donated millions to programs helping single mothers. He'd even started leaving the office at reasonable hours. "You know," Richard said one evening, "you never told me your third wish." Sophie had been waiting for the right moment. She snuggled closer to him on the couch, her small hand finding his much larger one. "My third wish is the most important one," she said quietly. "Are you ready?" Richard nodded, curious what could be more important than what she'd already wished for. "I wish you'd forgive yourself." The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Grace looked up from her book, understanding immediately. Richard stared at Sophie, confused. "Forgive myself for what?" "For being human," Sophie said. "For making mistakes. For not being perfect. You're still punishing yourself for your marriage ending, for not being there for your son, for all the things you think you did wrong. But you're a good person, Mr. Warren. You just forgot for a while. And my third wish is that you'd forgive yourself and believe that you deserve to be happy, to be loved, to have a family again." Richard's throat tightened. How did this child see straight into his soul? How did she know about the guilt he carried like chains, the self-hatred that had driven him to build walls around his heart? "I don't know if I can," he whispered honestly. "You can," Sophie said with absolute certainty. "Because we already forgive you. And if we can forgive you, why can't you forgive yourself?" That night, Richard let go of burdens he'd carried for over a decade. He forgave himself for failing his marriage, for being absent when his son needed him, for becoming so cold that he forgot how to feel. And in that forgiveness, he found something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The story could end here, but life isn't a fairy tale with neat conclusions. It's messier and more beautiful than that. Richard eventually sold some of his properties and started a foundation helping single parents. Grace became not just his estate manager but his friend, his conscience, his reminder of what truly matters. Sophie grew up in that mansion, surrounded by love, and went on to become a social worker helping families just like hers once was.
And Richard?
He learned that the greatest wealth isn't measured in properties or bank accounts. It's measured in the people who call you family, in the moments that take your breath away, in the courage to forgive and be forgiven. Because sometimes the greatest miracles aren't in what we receive, but in what we give away, and in the hearts we manage to heal along the way. The end. What would your 3 wishes be? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Story Room for meaningful stories that inspire and teach life lessons. Follow for part 2.